Hello and welcome back to the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. I'm your host, Meg Carney, and I'm an outdoor and environmental writer and author of the book, Outdoor Minimalist, Waste Less Hiking, Camping, and Backpacking. The Outdoor Minimalist podcast has the goal to give listeners actionable ways to waste less hiking, camping, backpacking, and more during every step of their process. Your impact outdoors starts long before you hit the trail and goes beyond leave no trace ethics. You'll learn how to identify sustainable outdoor brands, how to ask hard questions regarding sustainability, and begin to shift and evolve your mindset to integrate minimalism into all of your outdoor pursuits. In episode 91 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we are diving into a new topic, overlanding. Off-roading and using motorized vehicles to travel from place to place and across public lands has existed for a very long time. But it seems like it's grown in popularity within the last decade quite a lot. And with this boom of interest in overlanding and off-roading, there has also been a rise in concerns regarding the environmental impact of this type of outdoor recreation. To help me explain and explore this topic in a little more depth, I had the pleasure of interviewing Beth Brennan. Beth is the GM of Tread Agency. She's a marketer and project manager with over 10 years of experience in the outdoor industry. Beth is a brand marketer that has specialized in the overland space, having worked for Tempui Tents, the Tool Group, and Go Fast Campers. Beth sits on the SEMA, Specialty Equipment Manufacturers Association, Businesswomen's Select Committee, and recently participated in their all-female build with Ford Motor Company. Beth resides in Bozeman, Montana, and is involved in backcountry hunters and anglers, and is an advocate for conservation and public land access. Thank you for joining me today on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, Beth. I have been long awaiting our discussion about overlanding. It's something that I wanted to talk about for a long time on the show. But before we kind of dive into that topic, I would love to get to know you a little bit better first. So could you tell me how you first got into outdoor recreation and how it fits into your daily life?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me. It's great to be here and connect with you. I started in the outdoor industry about 10 years ago. I was working for a company, which is a quite large corporation called Aramark, and they have a leisure division that's more on the side of travel and hospitality than outdoor rec, but certainly it crosses over. They operate as a concessionaire in a lot of national parks, state parks, that sort of thing. So I was working in marketing for their leisure division out of Asilomar State Park, which is a California state park, doing primarily marketing, project management, that sort of thing for their leisure division. I was also working pretty closely alongside California state parks on some of their initiatives with conservation and land stewardship. So that's kind of how I first sort of became involved on the periphery. And then at that time, I was living in Santa Cruz, California, which is about an hour from Monterey. I was commuting about an hour and had been at a local event where I saw a company that I would later end up working for, Tempui Tents, and they were making rooftop tents primarily at that time. And, just kind of enjoyed the event, went along with my life, whatever. Not too long after that, they had posted a position for marketing manager, and I didn't really have any real experience in the outdoor industry, but I did have marketing experience that sort of translated. So that's how I first got involved in terms of my, professional career. On a personal level, I've always been interested in the outdoors. I grew up in rural Ohio on about 10 acres, building forts in the woods and exploring. My parents, my dad in particular, had an interest in the outdoors. So we spent a lot of time on family vacations, both more locally to that area, but, we also took a big family vacation through the Rockies to Banff. And we took a train from Vancouver to Banff and some trips out west and that sort of thing. So I think, that interest was sparked long before my professional career took off.
That's awesome. It sounds like a really epic trip to go through all the Rockies like that. And now you work for Tread Agency. So what was that transition like, going from Tempui and then transitioning into this position?
Yeah, so I've had a few different positions in between. At Tepui, I was there about 5 years. Really got to know what it looked like to use sort of more entrepreneurial approach. That company was started by essentially a husband and wife and one other partner um, that really just grew it from the ground up with their own like personal investments. So I was able to come in at a time where they were still very much in the growth stage and then see it through to where we were actually acquired by a large global company, which was the Thule Group based out of Sweden. Um, so from there, I went on and worked for Go Fast Campers because I had wanted to move to Montana for quite some time, but had put that off due to really loving my job at Tepui. Yeah, so I've been in Bozeman, Montana for the past couple years. I work for Go Fast Campers up here as well as Guide Fitter, which is more in sort of the hook and bullet space. And all this time, the overland space is sort of a crossover to my favorite things, which is sort of, outdoor rec and sort of vehicle rec, if you will, and where those two things merge. And I had an opportunity just sort of, I'd known some people through SEMA, and I'd known some people that kind of ran in some of these sort of same automotive groups. And I came to find that this agency that I had known, I'd never really met anyone there personally, but this was Con Media. So Dan Con was involved in SEMA. Some of the folks had a lot of crossover with companies I had worked with or vehicle builds for SEMA back all the way back when I was with Tepui. Has a really very strong reputation in that space. So I'd gotten wind that they were maybe going to start a new agency in the outdoor space. And then they had posted on LinkedIn about it. And finally I said, I want to find out what these guys are up to. So reached out to Dan Kahn, and sort of that's how I became involved with Tread. He was looking for someone to lead Tread. And yeah, so we're excited. We have a lot of the resources of Con Media, of course, behind us, which puts us in a great space to launch and grow a new agency. And then, for me, I've worked in both outdoor and automotive for a few years now, so have some relationships and know how to navigate that space. So that's kind of how I ended up with Tread. And yeah, we're kind of off and running at this point.
Nice. Yeah. Seems like a very organic transition. And for listeners that don't know, do you mind just explaining what Tread Agency is and what exactly you guys do?
Sure. Yeah. So we're a full service integrated marketing agency. We do PR, creative services. We can do events. We basically, most marketing services we can cover. Being part of Con Media, they've started out as a PR agency, but quickly saw how the sort of PR landscape was, changing over time. So yeah, those are kind of our core services alongside digital marketing. And we can help, businesses anywhere from like a long-term engagement, which is particularly helpful in the public relations side. We can do shorter term projects, go to market, creative video projects, that kind of thing. But we specialize in this space, which is outdoor rec. So we do sort of the broader umbrella of outdoor rec, and then we do overland, off-road, hunting, fishing, shooting, sports, hiking, camping, all of that.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's why you are the perfect person to talk about overlanding. You're pretty integrated into that sector of the outdoor industry. And overlanding is something that is relatively new to me. In terms of like when I started getting into the outdoor industry and stuff like that, I had heard of it, but didn't really know what the buzz was about. So if it's a term that listeners also aren't familiar with, do you mind just kind of defining it and explaining what exactly overlanding is and maybe what some of the activities um, would fall into that they'd be familiar with?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's undoubtedly a kind of an interesting term. I was actually just posting about this not too long ago on LinkedIn because we were hosting an Overland Summit media event for brands. But I was talking about how when I first started at Tepui, I understood the concept of the tent and on top of the car and all that. Um, that's something that has been around actually for much longer than it has in the United States. But I sort of laughed because I had to Google the term overlanding because my boss had said, we're going to this event. It's called Overland Expo in Flagstaff. And I thought, I'm just getting this job. I have no idea what that is. So I Googled the term, and, you know, it was a term I had to Google, but it was something, the actual description was something I'd been doing for years. So essentially, it's vehicle based travel with a heavy recreation component sort of woven in. In its true sense, I think what it really means is longer form vehicle travel. So cross continent travel, that sort of thing. Now it's sort of evolved a bit and brought into sort of more mainstream market. So now I think you could even categorize weekend car campers as overlanders. So there's, it's definitely evolved. I think there's a lot of different there's like the more hardcore side of it. And, one of our clients, Expedition Overland, just has this amazing film about the Nordic series, and they went all through the Scandinavian countries right after COVID. It doesn't have to be that extreme. I think it's really about the experience of getting out and having vehicle-based recreation available to you.
Yeah. So my question, I guess, about overlanding is kind of how it is categorized, because you're saying that it doesn't have to be so extreme, but like when I think about overlanding, I do think about the more like off-road type expeditions, or you are going like deeper into like public lands or even like across like specific countries or regions. So the vehicles are like pretty decked out, built out. They're obviously like designed to be off-road. But would you say that like van life would be kind of like a crossover into that? Because van life and overlanding, I feel like, are often categorized differently, but it feels like there's a lot that they do the same.
Yeah, I would categorize them as fairly similar. I mean, one outlier I would say is more of the off-road, sort of your more traditional, what you would call off-road, rock crawling, that sort of thing is a little different. I think most overlanders, I would say, are using a combination of sort of regular roads and then public land roads, right, to get where they're going. So there's definitely this off the grid component to it. It's not as hardcore as some of the off-road, like rock crawling type stuff. It's more about the journey and the travel and all the things that happen along the way. So in that regard, I would, uh, I'm not sure that there is a textbook definition, to be quite honest at this point, but I would include van life people to be on the periphery of that too. I'm sure there's some people who would say, "Oh no, that's something different." But I think when you're doing vehicle-based recreation and you um, have the right, you're modifying your vehicle to do that, I think that puts you in that category.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like everyone is going to have kind of like an opinion, especially if they're kind of deep into overlanding and like do more extreme like off-road stuff. They might categorize things differently than other people.
Oh, sure. It's like a whole world. I mean, I think there's probably overlanders who look down on rock crawlers and vice versa. And then, it's just like anything else where you get into it and it's a niche industry, sure, but then there's 100 other little sort of mini niche industries within it.
Always technicalities, always.
Yes.
So how long do you think overlanding has been a thing? Because I feel like it has like gained a lot of popularity in the last like 10 or so years, at least more so in the mainstream. So how long has it been kind of a part of the outdoor industry? And how do you think it has kind of like changed or evolved over the last decade, I guess?
Yeah, so I can certainly, make a educated guess when it comes to the United States and North America. I think prior to it coming on to the scene here, it's been going on forever. Like, I couldn't even imagine what year to say. And there were people, you know, well, to give an example, when my boss from Tepui went down to Venezuela, people were using like what essentially was a rooftop tent to get up off the ground from critters and things like that. And they just had a wooden frame um, as their tent. So I think it's important to recognize that just because the term overland has sort of become a thing here in the United States, we have to also remember that we are actually fairly late adopters to it. If you look at South Africa, if you look at Australia, if you look at many parts of South America, there's been elements of overland around, and certainly even sort of like the OGs in the United States who were doing these crazy trips that we now call overlanding, back in like the 70s and stuff like that. So, I would look at it from what I do know, which is, the past 10 years of being in the industry. And certainly we saw it grow from, um, like Overland Expo, which is sort of the flagship event for overland stuff. It used to be like this smaller event that was very kind of like, um, just more of like a meetup sort of a thing, and now we have very corporate players involved in that event. So it has changed a lot over the last 10 years, I would say. And that's kind of how I look at it. Is in the United States, I would say about 10 years, 10 or 15 years old when you look at like, I guess, major brands getting involved is how I'll, put that timeline on it.
Yeah, making more of like a market stake in the industry kind of thing in the last 10 years.
Yeah, because I think if you were to say how long has it been around, gosh, that's just too difficult of a thing to answer, both US and abroad. But if I look at like more of the commercial interest, I would say it's really ramped up in the past 10 years.
Yeah, why do you think that is? Why do you think there was such a like a boom and growing interest in it in the like recent years in the United States if it's been like common elsewhere in the world for so long?
I mean, I think there were some key players that, started showing this lifestyle. I mean, similar to you bringing up van life, I think social media and things like that certainly helped escalate these things. I mean, look, you've got a product that lends itself nicely for photography. You've got this adventure travel element. You've got this sort of aspirational lifestyle element, freedom, all these things. That certainly, all of that is escalated through social media and, sharing of all of those things digitally. The second sort of boost, I would say, is during COVID. I mean, this outdoor recreation as a whole, but also in the subcategory of overland, there was a huge boost both in interest and, for revenue for the companies that had the supply chain to accommodate it. So I would say, like, off the top of my head, I would think that those are the two main drivers that we've seen in the past 10 years that have, contributed to the popularity of it.
Yeah, I feel like all outdoor sports kind of, or I guess I don't know, overlanding is not really a sport. Activities, outdoor activities, saw a lot of growth over COVID and after because people just like maintained that interest.
Yeah, and
And
I think it's continuing on that trajectory. I don't think that's ending with COVID from what I can tell.
yeah, which there are pros and cons to that, I suppose, that
Sure.
level of popularity. Um, and what would you say is kind of like the perception of overlanding from an industry and individual perspective? Because I do know that with certain activities, there tend to be, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. There tend to be strong opinions at times, like coming from other sectors. So, like, a good example would be like equestrians and mountain bikers, like there's usually
Oh,
some tension
mhm.
between them. So, do you think that the general perception of overlanding in the industry is positive?
I think there's always going to be those complications within outdoor rec. I don't think any of us are immune to it. And I think, if it's not happening to you in one sport, it's happening to you in another, right? Like, I think that's kind of the lay of the land when it comes to shared use. Um, in terms of how people view it, it's sort of relative. I mean, I think actually rock crawlers kind of get a bad name, probably even from overlanders. So, whether that's right or whether that's wrong, I'm not here to speculate on that. But I would say that I think, you know, the it's a balance. There's people. I was actually speaking with someone who's an angler and conservation person, and mentioned something to me about driving through rivers, which is maybe not something that I 100% had on my radar. And I'm an angler too, and I'm a conservationist too. So these things all require a bit of balance. And in terms of shared use, I think that the overland thing is right now, generally speaking, by most parties, it has a fairly okay / favorable view. I think there's some more hardcore people who worry about trail use and things like that. And if you look at the demographic and sort of the market research around who overlanders are, um, you know, it's generally sort of, I think, politically neutral, but they tend to be a higher demographic. They tend to be not really out there like partying and causing trouble per se. So I think it's like anything else where you get a bit of a mix in terms of, you know, trail use. We've seen a lot of people really involved in like the cleanups, and you've seen some even the more major corporate players getting involved in that. So I don't really see a conflict. At the same time, I try to be reasonable and hear out, you know, anything people are saying about concerns around that. And you know, the thing about the river was one that I was like, okay, well, thank you for bringing that up, because, you know, maybe I hadn't always thought about certain aspects of it.
Yeah, and I mean, I would assume that since anytime you're driving a motorized vehicle, whether it be like an overland rig of any kind, or even like a four-wheeler or a dirt bike or something like that, that's going to have a higher impact than someone walking.
Walking, sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, there's like a number of ways, like I said, to look at that. I think that is certainly true. I also think grazing cattle on public lands has more impact than, you know, a few overland people coming through. So where, you know, how that is dealt with in terms of regulation on public lands is sort of a personal outlook, right? As to what you think. And I tend to think that the more people can get outside in as many different ways that they can get outside, that we're going to end up with more people who care about outside. So that's where, while I'm a conservationist and I understand concerns around motorized use, even when it comes to, you know, I live near Yellowstone, and that's the thing with snowmobiles and things like that too. My general thought on it is that exposure to the outdoors helps more people care about protecting the outdoors. And that's not ever going to be a perfect scenario, but, you know, that's where I personally, um, that's how I look at it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with that as well. That's kind of how I see things. Um, and you were kind of talking about the demographics that enjoy overlanding, and I would kind of assume that it would be kind of like older adults, not older, I would say, but like not like teens and young 20s, because the overlanding seems like it is quite the investment to get started. Like you have to buy a vehicle that is suitable for this, and oftentimes like alter it or like add things to it, change things on it. Um, so do you think like the general age range that is participating in overlanding maybe like contributes to the level of responsibility while they're out there?
That certainly could be. I mean, we back at Tepui, when I did first go to Overland Expo, we used to call them the wine and cheese crowd, because we were marketing to a couple different crowds, but we would call the Overlanders the wine and cheese crowd. And back then, you had people with $100,000 rigs that had been places you've never heard of, certainly skewed older, high income. It still remains a demographic that I think the nature of buying extra things for maybe that you don't really need, or that are for your vehicle, or they're for a hobby, the nature of that is going to skew you towards a higher income demographic, right? That's just the way it is. But I think that, all that being said, now we see in the past couple of years younger people being interested, and even older people being interested. I mean, my mom is in her 70s and rented an RV to go across the US last year, which is like, you know, something, I know that older people like to do that, but that was like totally out of her league of interest. But all these people started hearing about this stuff during COVID, and then you've got some older people in the mix too. So, and I'm not talking about the main demographic, I'm talking older than that. But I think the nature of where it's evolved to now, that there's also, I think, some changing economic forces in terms of what people value, right? Like people are valuing working remotely and flexibility, and maybe they're changing their tune on how they look at work-life balance, and all that is skewing to a younger generation's interest in these things too. And I think it's important to highlight that.
Yeah, that is kind of like changing as the industry expands and more people grow interest, of course it is going to evolve. So that makes a lot of sense. Um, and you touched a little bit on a couple of the ways that it could have a higher impact than other types of recreation. But what would you say are kind of like the blanket or most common or largest impacts that overlanding has environmentally? And this could be like direct impacts of while you're recreating or even
Hmm.
the production of the vehicles themselves.
Sure. I think when it comes to and sort of with this, like speaking about demographics and that sort of thing, I don't think these people are people who are necessarily littering and leaving a bunch of junk behind them. But certainly vehicle-based recreation comes with a certain, you know, look, you need gas to power this trip in many cases, although there are, the EV thing is coming in pretty hot too. Um, so there's that. And then there's sort of, maybe a bit of overconsumption when it comes to altering the vehicles in some cases. In some cases, people are going over the top with what they need. In other cases, you can get away with much less than what some people are sort of presenting as needed. I have to think like the biggest impact, and while this is a little outside of my expertise, so it's a bit of a speculation, but I would say, the dependency on gas for sure would be one element. And then, yeah, just from I guess, a consumerism and production standpoint, one could argue that, it could be a little over the top in that regard too, because it's not stuff. Sometimes there's a lot of extra that you don't really need. Let's put it that way.
I think that's true in every activity.
Sure.
Absolutely. The overlanders are not alone there. Um, Yeah, and so, like, if you're thinking about that, like, just in terms of, like, the potential overconsumption and then, like, the inherent impact of driving a vehicle, whether you're driving to work or for recreation, um, how do you think people can best, like, balance that? Like, balance their impact and minimize their impact, but still enjoy the things that they like to do?
I know. I think it's similar to any outdoor recreation person. It's about taking care of the places you visit and being a responsible steward of the land. And I think overlanders, for the most part, are following that and are well positioned to do that. I mean, we did had a corporate, we had a client, Quadratech, who partnered with Tread Lightly right ahead of SEMA, and I did that event with them to go out and do a desert cleanup. And we had the local 4x4 group and a lot of stakeholders. And I think doing that kind of thing is really important. And like we're saying here, that's not specific to overland people. That's backpackers and mountain bikers and backcountry skiers and everybody doing their part. It's definitely something I worry about with the increase of outdoor recreation. And, there's a lot of legislation going on, and both on a local up to federal level, of expanding access. And that's generally all good. But, there is sometimes an element of overuse, whether that's vehicle or any recreation activity, really.
Yeah, and since you brought up kind of like different legislations and stuff like that, do you think that the current regulations around motorized vehicle use on public lands are sufficient or like could they be better?
I mean, things could always be improved, I'm sure. In Montana, on some trails, not overland and off-road trails, but we have dirt bikes here, which is, as a hiker, so look, I get it. Like, the same thing that people complain about on any motorized vehicle is something that I might complain about if I'm in the woods and a dirt bike comes ripping through and I'm breathing exhaust, right? So Montana's had an interesting take in that they have like different days that people are allowed to use different trails if there's a motorized element involved. But I don't really fall into the category of like, um, that good stewardship comes from regulation. I think good stewardship comes from sense of community and sense of obligation that goes far deeper than something that the government is going to tell us how to use our public lands that we pay taxes for. That being said, I very much sympathize with people who don't want to be breathing exhaust on a trail. And I think there's a balance there. And I think that that should, in many cases, be up to a local level to help understand that balance and what's best for their community.
Yeah, and in terms of, like, sharing the space, so, like, obviously, a lot of different people and demographics are using public lands or trails. So what types of, like, conversations or considerations do you think all users should be making in order to, I guess, be more respectful to other patrons?
You mean on like an individual basis, right?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Like, if
I mean,
there's, like, a dirt biker and a hiker, like, how can we coexist and not be irritated with each other?
yeah, I mean, I think like the time restriction that Montana, that we have in my area is sort of interesting. Um, I can't really complain if I'm out there on the day that is been designated as it's allowed for dirt bikers, right? That being said, I think as people who recreate, I mean, look, my husband's a mountain biker. He gets annoyed by horse use. So there's something for everybody to be happy about and to complain about when it comes to sharing the space. So I think really what we have to do is have a degree of empathy for one another, whether you are a hunter or you're not, or whether you're, dirt biker or you're not. It doesn't really matter. I mean, we all use motor-based vehicle, we always all use vehicles to get somewhere somehow. We're none of us are immune to that. So I think really that empathy is the answer. And, while I'm personally not a hunter, I have great respect for hunters in my area and how and certain things that they're doing. And I think that sort of principle could translate in this scenario as well, which is like we all want public land access. We all you know, we might vary in degree as to how we approach conservation, but certainly we all see the benefit or we wouldn't be there in the first place. And I think that's something important for us all to remember despite our differences.
And if people, are interested in overlanding and, like, wanna learn more about it or, like, try it out, what resources or, like, if you know of any, like, outfitters or anything like that, could you recommend to listeners that are just, like, interested in trying it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's some outfitters and groups that'll take you out. A friend of mine, his name's Todd, he runs 4 Points Adventures. He'll take people out to Death Valley and places like that. And he, is very conscious of all the permits and everything that needs to be done and sort of the conservation elements as well. So in fact, I just talked to another guy who's in Ireland. He runs Flat Cap Adventures, and he's doing that as well. So I think that's a nice way to sort of dip your toes in and learn some of the basic recovery things that you might need to know too before you get out there all alone. Um, Without any help on the way if something goes wrong. So there's two elements there, right? Like there's the seeing if you're interested in it sort of aspirationally, and then there's also the learning components that will help you feel more confident when you're out there to kind of know the basics of how to deal with your vehicle if you get in a situation.
Yeah, having a general knowledge of, like, vehicle repair and stuff, I feel like would be really important. Yeah, that is something to think about.
It's like anything else though, you don't really want to be in skiing in the backcountry completely alone without a way to call for help. Like, there's best practices that you can apply elsewhere into this scenario as well. And certainly, you don't have to have someone with you, but it's always nice to have a technology backup if you don't. So
Mhm.
that's something. And I think, one of the good things about sort of the commercialization of overland space is that now we have a lot of those tools, which, I don't want to see every last trail called out or mapped or anything like that, but it's also good to know that if you get in a jam that you're not completely SOL, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There are definitely some benefits to it becoming more popular, and more accessible. I think in a lot of ways, overlanding does make certain types of recreation or outdoor spaces more accessible to people that wouldn't otherwise be visiting. So I think that can be positive as well. Although some people would probably see that as a negative. So
Sure. Yeah. And when I go back to always with that, like I'm one of those people probably who thinks a little bit of both for myself selfishly. That being said, I have to think that in the greater scheme of things, more people caring about the outdoors is a benefit for all of us. At least that's the optimist in me speaking. So
it's okay. I like to have a flare of optimism when I think of things like this. Otherwise, it just becomes a little bit too disappointing sometimes. You have to be
yeah,
optimistic about
yeah.
certain things. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing all that information. And to kind of close things out, how can listeners learn more about you and Tread Agency?
Yeah, so we're on all the social channels, Tread Agency. My name's Beth Brennan. I'm mostly on LinkedIn, Instagram. But yeah, Tread is off and running, and we have a couple of exciting events this summer for brands to get involved as well. On the media side, we're hosting a couple events with brands and media. So if that's of interest to anybody out there listening, or if there's anything I can ever help with, I'm at beth@treadagency.com.
Awesome. And I'll be sure to share all that in the episode notes so people can access that very easily. But thanks so much, Beth, for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.